How temporary rules learn to never leave. They were introduced with expiration dates. They were justified as short-term fixes, and then they quietly became permanent. To understand how temporary rules learn to never leave, we have to examine what happens after a crisis ends. In the aftermath, urgency fades, but structures remain. Regulations, exemptions, and emergency authorities are rarely dismantled all at once. They linger, waiting for the next justification. Today's banking system is layered with rules born from past emergencies. Each one solved a specific problem at a specific moment, but together, they form a framework shaped more by reaction and design. What was meant to stabilize gradually hardened into baseline policy. At first, these rules felt intrusive. Banks adjusted reluctantly. Markets complained. But time normalized them. Compliance became routine. Systems were rebuilt around the new constraints. What once felt temporary began to feel inevitable. Crises create permission to bypass process, permission to accelerate decisions, permission to act first and explain later. When those actions succeed, reversing them becomes difficult. Success validates permanence. This is how temporary measures survive, not because they are debated and renewed, but because removing them feels riskier than keeping them. The absence of crisis becomes proof that the rules are working. Slowly, the system forgets what life looked like before them, and what was meant to expire becomes a foundation for what comes next. As temporary rules settled in, their presence began shaping behavior in ways never originally intended. Banks stopped treating them as emergency constraints and started treating them as operating assumptions. Business models adjusted. Strategies evolved. Compliance became architecture. This adaptation created a quiet dependency. Systems were optimized around the rules rather than around the risks they were meant to control. Removing a rule now threatened disruption, not relief. What once limited behavior now defined it. Regulators faced a familiar dilemma. Rolling back protections risked instability. Leaving them untouched risked rigidity. Every proposal to unwind temporary measures triggered warnings about unintended consequences. Markets preferred predictability over reform. Each crisis added more layers. New rules stacked on top of old ones. Rarely did they replace each other. Complexity grew. The framework became harder to navigate, even for those enforcing it. Yet complexity itself became a stabilizer. Fewer people understood the system well enough to challenge it. Public attention drifted elsewhere. Without visible emergencies, rules faded into the background. They were no longer debated because they were no longer noticed. Their permanence was secured through silence, not approval. This evolution changed the meaning of regulation. Rules stopped being responses to specific threats. They became general tools for managing uncertainty. The system shifted from correcting behavior to containing outcomes. What began as protection gradually turned into inertia. And inertia, once established, proved more durable than any crisis that created it. The conflict emerged when these permanent temporary rules began constraining the system's ability to adapt. What once offered flexibility during crisis now imposed rigidity during calm. Innovation slowed where rules were blunt. Risk migrated where rules were silent. Banks learned how to operate around constraints rather than within their spirit. Compliance became a strategic exercise. Resources flowed toward navigating frameworks instead of strengthening fundamentals. The rules remained, but their original purpose diluted. Regulators felt the tension as well. Changing rules required political capital and public trust. Leaving them untouched required accepting growing inefficiencies. Each option carried risk. Each delay made reform harder. Temporary measures had become structural anchors. This rigidity produced uneven effects. Large institutions absorbed compliance costs easily. Smaller banks struggled. Entry barriers rose. Competition thinned. Stability improved, but dynamism suffered. The system became safer, but less responsive. The emotional peak arrived quietly, not with a collapse, but with frustration. A recognition that the framework designed to protect the system was also limiting its evolution. Safety and stagnation began to blur. At this stage, the question was no longer whether the rules should exist. It was whether a system built on accumulated reactions could still adapt deliberately, and whether permanence born from crisis could be reshaped without triggering another one. The climax came with an uncomfortable realization. The system was no longer governed by intentional design, but by accumulated survival instincts. Temporary rules had outlived their emergencies and quietly redefined normal. The resolution is not about removing every rule. It is about recognizing how permanence changes purpose. Rules meant to stabilize became default operating conditions. Flexibility narrowed. Adaptation slowed. The system became robust, but less agile. This trade-off defines modern banking. Safety is higher. Failure is rarer. But evolution is cautious, constrained by frameworks built for yesterday's threats. The system resists change not because it cannot evolve, but because change feels risky in a structure designed to avoid risk at all costs. Today, these never-ending temporary rules continue to shape decisions. They influence who can compete, how innovation emerges, and where risk quietly migrates. Stability is preserved, but progress is carefully managed. What started as emergency protection became long-term architecture. And architecture, once built, is hard to redesign without shaking the foundation. There is a further dimension to the permanence of temporary rules. That explains why they are so resistant even to well-intentioned reform. Each rule, no matter how narrow its original purpose, creates a constituency, not a political constituency in the formal sense, but a behavioral one, a group of institutions, professionals, practices, and expectations that have organized themselves around the rule's existence. Compliance departments exist because the rule exists. Auditing practices are built around the rule's requirements. Risk models incorporate the rule's parameters. Legal frameworks reference the rule's language. Every one of these dependencies is individually rational. Together, they create a web of interest in the rule's continuation that is diffuse, decentralized, and therefore extremely hard to dislodge. No single actor has enough to gain from removal to fight for it loudly. Every actor has something to lose from disruption, and disruption, not the rule itself, becomes the thing that must be justified. The asymmetry is almost unfair. Rules arrive with urgency behind them. Reform arrives with a burden of proof. That asymmetry explains more about the permanence of temporary measures than any individual decision-maker's reluctance to act. It is structural, embedded in how regulation interacts with the institutions it governs, and understanding it is a prerequisite for anyone who hopes to change it deliberately, rather than waiting for the next crisis to force a reset that nobody had time to think through carefully, which is, of course, how the temporary rules arrived in the first place. Urgency, no time for deliberation, no space for competing interests to negotiate, only the immediate need to stop something terrible from happening. And in that compressed moment, rules are written, constituencies form around them, and then time passes, and the urgency is forgotten, but the rules remain, because dismantling them requires the one thing that their creation never did. Time, deliberate, unhurried, contested time, time for all the constituencies to negotiate, time for the costs and benefits to be weighed carefully, time for the system to imagine what it might look like differently. That time is available during calm. It is rarely used, because calm, unlike crisis, does not compel action, and so the temporary rules wait, patient and permanent, while the system around them quietly learns to call them by another name, normal, until the next crisis arrives, and the cycle begins again. New urgency, new rules, new constituencies forming around them before the ink is dry. And somewhere in the layers of what came before, the old temporary rules continue to do their quiet work, unnoticed, unrepealed, permanent in everything but name. That is not a failure of governance. It is governance as it actually operates, in the real world, under the real constraints of time, interest, and urgency, imperfect, layered, and remarkably resilient, even when the resilience was never planned.